Schönen guten Abend. Hello from Heidelberg to wherever. My name is Jagoda Marinic. With me is JJ Bola, right from London. Hi, JJ.
Hi.
Hi. We are coming into your living rooms tonight from Heidelberg and from London to present this really important book JJ has written and published in Germany in August 2020. And we are here tonight to talk about why masculinity has to be rethought and unlearned the way we have learned it. JJ has written a really important book that is very accessible and gives very emotional stories and yet very reflective. So I'm very happy to have him here tonight. Ich sage jetzt noch, just hi, JJ. Ich sage jetzt noch 2 Sätze für unser deutsches Publikum. Wir machen das Ganze auf Englisch, weil eben auch Leute vielleicht bei ihm mitschauen und ihr könnt ja sicher alle wunderbar Englisch. Das heißt, ich werde jetzt gleich hier 2 Seiten auf Deutsch lesen, damit ihr so ein bisschen Gefühl kriegt für die deutsche Fassung. Ihr könnt das deutsche Buch eben auch erwerben. Aber dann liest JJ, und zwar die englische Fassung. Und wir kommen dann auch ein bisschen ins Gespräch, denn das Thema ist ja gar nicht ohne. Also manche hören, sei kein Mann und sind verletzt. Was soll das heißen? Ist Männlichkeit negativ? Auf Englisch heißt das Ganze Mask Off. Und damit würde ich vielleicht auch das Gespräch anfangen. JJ, your book in English is called Mask Off.
Yes.
It's translated like Don't Be a Man. Mm-hmm. But would you tell us something about why you call the English version Mask Off?
Yeah. So the main reason was, well, there was 2 reasons really. The first is obviously it's a play on words about masculinity, so the mask and masculinity, but also a play on the fact that what we learn as masculinity is often a performance. And so a lot of the times as men, we wear a mask. You know, when we go out in the world, you know, we're told to be strong, told to be tough, told to be kind of like dominant and so forth. And I think that mask is a facade. It's an appearance that a lot of men wear, but it's not really who they are inside. And so the title is an appeal really to men to take off their masks and be who they really are. And also on the other side of the title is that there's a song by an American rapper called Future, and he's got a song called Mask Off. And in this song, you know, it's incredibly popular. I think around 2016 or 2017, very popular that summer. And in that song, Mask Off, he's talking a lot about very kind of sexist, misogynist, materialistic, stereotypical views and stereotypical portrayals. But the origin of the sample that was used in that song was a song that was about civil rights, and it was about love and compassion and justice. And so that made me think of the way that masculinity and the perception of masculinity has changed over the years. You know, like if you think about the era of the 60s, there was perhaps this expectation that a man is dutiful and honorable. And then now, you know, the expectation has completely changed. And what does that mean for the way that we are raising our young boys?
So you think the masculinity has become like more aggressive or portrayed more aggressive, especially in the cultural areas that you referred to, like gangster rap or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you especially compare that in terms of music, you know, listen to soul music, listen to the blues, right? And this was popular music. If we listen to B.B. King, for example, these are musicians who are crying through the guitar, who are crying about their love or losing their job or whatever it was that they were going through. And that was very much normal. But if you compare that to modern portrayals of masculinity, I can't think of the last time that I really heard a song where a man was being completely emotional about his experiences, particularly on the mainstream level. So much of what we consume is based on toxic masculinity, on hypermaterialism, on capitalism as well. And I'm not saying that there weren't any issues then in terms of masculinity or patriarchy. I'm just saying that it's an ever-changing thing. And so why not, if it's going to be something that changes, why can't we then make it into something that's positive for everyone, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it just made me think of a quote I remember Joni Mitchell saying, because, you know, she was back then with Bob Dylan and all these pure singing they made, and they stood at the stage, having their guitar, their voices and their feelings. And then she said there was the time Michael Jackson came on the scene and everything was like, I'm bad, you know it. And she was like, well, I'm not bad. I don't know what to do in here now. And she kind of lost access to the pop music industry when this happened. Do you think there's a specific time, or is there a person or two that you would even say call responsible for the change or the shift when it happened? Is there a certain star you remember who really introduced the change, or do you think it's like it happened over the years and you can't name 2 or 3 people?
I think it's happened over the years, and it's kind of like a relay race, you know? You have someone on the first leg who goes a little bit further, and then each person takes it a little bit further, and it gets a little bit worse, and the message becomes a bit more toxic along the way. So let's look at Tupac, who I mentioned in the book, right? He's a very contradictory, ironic person, character, and artist, because on the one side, he talks about very toxic, masculine, aggressive things, materialistic, capitalist things. But on the other side, he's also talking about women's issues, gender empowerment. And so he was someone who was very aware. But then if you move forward now, and if you look at like the I mentioned, Future, okay, he's got the toxic materialistic thing, but there isn't that part where he's talking about anything to do with gender equality. And so even if you think of them on the mainstream level, like who's an artist that, especially in terms of like rap, that is talking about that? And so for me, it's about kind of like challenging, because it's not just one stream, but if we look at how it's represented, masculinity is represented in movies, action movies. I mean, how many Fast and Furious movies are we gonna get? You know, there's like 10 now. There's maybe even
sure. I mean, super interesting. I remember back then when we had Yo MTV Raps and these things, you know, when MTV was the big thing, and then the rap thing started, and then you had Snoop Doggy Dogg, and then he was going out with J-Lo, but then he started hitting her, and you had all these toxic masculinity in an industry that had so much access into the living room of young men, as you say. So,
exactly. And then now it's like the issues of like the Me Too movement and so forth have brought light to certain things, certain problems that existed for a long time in the industry. So what I'm saying is like, well, we can work on these issues. And it's not something that I'm saying for the first time. Like, it's been something that's been said for a long time. I'm just putting it in a language that relates to people at a certain point in time. And so I think like for the children of the future and so forth, I look at myself and think, well, I wish I had the book like this when I was 16, but now there are 16-year-olds who's going to have books like this. And hopefully that will be able to influence them. But also there's going to be older men. You know, I've had men in their 50s and 60s send me a message or email me or tweet me saying how much they related with the book and loved it as well. So I think it's a book for everyone.
I think what's so good about it is that it's so liberating, because you always think of feminists like running behind men and feeling like you have to change in the way I want. And then you have a man standing there and say, it's not that I have to change, I want to change. You know, it's because of myself. And I do want the women to profit from it, but mainly it's for the sake of my own soul. And I would love to just read a little bit in German for the people, so they just know they should get this book for Christmas. And
your German is better than mine, so please.
Yeah, we agreed on that one. So I'll start with a very relatable story, which really, is an easy way to understand also the way people looked at you and how you started looking at yourself by the way how they looked at you. So just all the gaze of the others, how much it makes us the man we think we have to be. So I really think that's a very, very relatable beginning of the book. So I'll read this in German, and then we'll have you reading in English, and then we'll have a little bit of talking afterwards.
Okay.
Okay? So, Mask off Mann sein. An einem sonnigen Samstagnachmittag in meiner Jugendzeit, bevor es Touchscreens, Selfies und 4G gab und bevor die sozialen Medien jeden Aspekt unseres Daseins durchdrungen hatten, lief ich durch die pulsierende, oft turbulente, multikulturelle, dynamische Tottenham High Road im Norden Londons. Ich war mit einer großen Gruppe von etwa 10 meiner Onkel zusammen. Es waren nicht wirklich meine Onkel. Sie waren keine Blutsverwandten, sondern die Männer der kongolesischen Gemeinschaft, in der ich aufgewachsen war. Als Teil einer Kirchengruppe organisierten sie samstags Aktivitäten für junge Leute in der Community. Es gab ein Blasensemble und andere kulturelle Initiativen. Nachdem ich an einer dieser Samstagveranstaltungen teilgenommen hatte, war ich zum Essen bei einem Onkel eingeladen worden, der ganz in der Nähe der Hauptstraße lebte. Ich war ganz außer mir vor Freude. Ein unerwartetes Festmahl aus Pondu, Makemba, Mikate und Taha. Eintopf, Kochbanane, Teigbällchen, auch Puff-Puff bekannt, und gegrillter Ziege erwartete mich. Was für ein Privileg. Wir gingen die Hauptstraße entlang zu seinem Haus und unterhielten uns angeregt. Mit meiner Trainingshose, meinem Hoodie und den Nike Air Force 1 war ich ganz offensichtlich der einzige Jugendliche in der Gruppe. Die anderen waren in der einzigartigen Mode kongolesischer Männer gekleidet. Jeans mit hoher Taille, farbenfrohe T-Shirts, die eng an ihnen unsportlichen, bierbäuchigen Körper lagen, Designermarken und exzentrische Design. Während wir die Straße entlang liefen, fühlte ich mich mit einem Mal sehr befangen und wurde mit der Gruppe, mit der ich unterwegs war, immer bewusster. Obwohl mir Tottenham sehr vertraut war, ich verbrachte als Jugendlicher sehr viel Zeit dort und war oft auf eben jenen Straßen unterwegs, wenn auch mit einer komplett anderen Gruppe und zu einem anderen Zweck, fühlte ich mich befangen, weil sie sehr viel Aufmerksamkeit auf uns zogen, nicht nur als große Gruppe, sondern als eine große Gruppe exzentrisch gekleideter afrikanischer Männer, die sich lauthals auf Lingala unterhielten. Ich sah auch viele andere Jugendliche. Schon von weitem fingen einige an zu starren, auf uns zu zeigen und sogar zu lachen. Ich war mir sicher, dass manche von ihnen mich erkannten, weshalb ich mich zu verstecken versuchte, indem ich meine Kapuze aufsetzte. Im Nachhinein hatte es wahrscheinlich sogar den gegenteiligen Effekt. Wir bahnten uns weiterhin als Gruppe den Weg, jeweils zu zweit oder dritt vertieft in unsere Gespräche. Ich ging mit meinem Onkel an der Hand. In der kongolesischen frankophonen afrikanischen Kultur ist das völlig normal und, wie ich später erfuhr, in vielen anderen Kulturen der Welt auch. Es bietet Männern die Möglichkeit, sich miteinander verbunden zu fühlen und einander Affinität und Zuneigung zu zeigen. Das ist die Kultur, in der ich aufgewachsen bin. Ich hatte meinen Vater oft Hand in Hand mit anderen Männern aus unserer Gemeinschaft gesehen, wenn sie sich miteinander unterhielten oder spazieren gingen. Es war normal und in solchen Situationen machte ich mir keine weiteren Gedanken darüber. Außerhalb der kulturellen Normen dieser Gruppe nahm es jedoch eine befremdliche und eher peinliche Qualität an. Zu meiner großen Erleichterung bogen wir von der Hauptstraße ab und liefen in Richtung der Wohnsiedlung, in der der Onkel wohnte, bei dem wir eingeladen waren. Ich war schon viele Male bei ihm zu Hause gewesen. Am liebsten wäre ich allein vor den Onkeln dorthin gelaufen und hätte auf sie gewartet, aber dann würde die Last, ihnen dieses Verhalten erklären zu müssen, deutlich länger anhalten, als ich es wollte oder brauchte. Ich atmete jetzt wieder ein bisschen entspannter und freier, obwohl ich immer noch Hand in Hand mit meinem Onkel ging. Wir befanden uns nicht mehr in diesem direkten Blickfeld all dieser Leute auf der Straße, insbesondere der Jugendlichen. Als wir die Siedlung, in der mein Onkel lebte, beschwingt und ausgelassen betraten, bemerkte uns eine Gruppe von Jugendlichen, die in der Siedlung abhing. Sie beobachteten uns. Ihre Blicke konzentrierten sich auf mich und den Onkel, mit dem ich Hand in Hand ging. Eine Reihe von negativen Gesichtsausdrücken, von Verwirrung bis hin zu Ekel, war in ihren Gesichtern zu lesen. Ich hatte diese Jugendlichen schon mal in der Siedlung gesehen. Manchmal hatte ich ihnen sogar kaum merklich zugenickt, eine Art des Grüßens, die bei uns mit Respekt und Anerkennung einhergeht. In dieser Wohnsiedlung, in jeder Großwohnsiedlung, jedem sozialen Brennpunkt, jeder Hood, jedem Ghetto, jedem Enz, jedem Slum, wie auch immer der Name lauten mag, hängt Respekt davon ab, wie stark du bist oder zumindest, wie stark du wahrgenommen wirst. Ich hatte lange genug bei diesem Spielchen mitgemacht, um respektiert zu werden. Ich war groß und sah sportlich aus. Dank früher Bekanntschaft mit Liegestützen und Gewichten wirkte ich gerade einschüchternd genug. All der Respekt, den ich mir verdient hatte, löste sich blitzschnell vor meinen Augen in Luft auf, als man mich Hand in Hand mit einem Mann spazieren gehen sah. Ich wollte meine Kapuze wieder aufsetzen und mein Gesicht verstecken, aber es war zu spät, ich war bereits gesehen worden. Ich löste meine Hand schnell aus der meines Onkels und tat so, als ob ich etwas in meiner Tasche suchte, was ihn nicht sonderlich zu stören schien. Ein weiterer vergeblicher Akt. »Jo, Großer«, hörte ich eine Stimme rufen. Ich wusste, er sprach mit mir und mit niemandem sonst. Ich sah hinüber. Seine Augen durchbohrten meine Brust. Ich fühlte meine Beine zittern, als würden meine Knie bei jedem Schritt nachgeben. Er hatte eine Kapuze auf und trug den grauen Nike-Trainingsanzug und Hoodie, um den ihn alle beneideten. »Na, bist am Händchen halten«, sagte er, und die Crew um ihn herum kicherte und brach dann in schallendes Gelächter aus. Ich kann mich noch an den Schmerz erinnern, an den Stich im Herzen. Ein ähnliches Gefühl, wie wenn scharfes Essen sich von gut schmeckend in nicht mehr auszuhalten verwandelt und du dir wünschst, alles würde sich wieder beruhigen. »Nein«, antwortete ich in einem Ton, der zeigte, dass ich verärgert war über so eine Andeutung. Alobinini, mein Onkel, der sich über die ganze Aufregung wunderte, fragte mich, was der Typ eigentlich gesagt hatte. »Nichts«, antwortete ich verächtlich. Er hat nach der Uhrzeit gefragt. So, J.J. Bola, sei kein Mann.
That was wonderful, wonderful reading.
Thank you, JJ. And I love this scene because it really shows, I mean, I guess every boy knows it, just the other people's gaze and what other peer groups expect you to be. And yeah, and especially when you have like conflicts of loyalty, there's these people that you belong to and the young people you want to belong to, or at least be respected by. So I think it really shows, a good moment of a young boy being really in conflict about a positive tradition and masculinity he may have inherited, and the toxic masculinity around him in his hood. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'd be very, very happy to hear you read in English and present us some more aspects of your book.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to start with reading a poem. And it's a poem about masculinity, it's about being a man. But I wrote this poem, oh gosh, maybe around 7 years ago now. So it's maybe around 2012 or 2013. And I guess this was also, I was exploring this issue of masculinity and being a man and so forth, but in a much earlier stage. And yeah, so the poem, so it's in my poetry book called Refuge. This is another poetry book I have. And the poem is called Real Men. I was told to be a man, a real man. Apparently that meant never to cry. That meant my eyes had to be like shutters. So when it came to emotions, my feelings were like a church monastery. I had none. I was told that to cry was to show weakness. But in this world, you have to be strong to survive. Walk with a mask on your face, a screw face, and never show what's going on inside from young. We were taught how to make guns out of fingers until we became old enough to shoot them. Guard your heart from the start. We danced bad to Michael Jackson Thriller until we became real life smooth criminals. Conditioned by the media subliminal, it isn't our human nature. It is indoctrination. Our voices were silenced, so we practiced violence on all platforms, from PlayStation and Xbox to that boy Michael's face. We were never taught it was wrong, because as a real man, anger is the only accepted response. Just think of how uncomfortable you get when you see a grown man cry. Think of the number of times your mother used to say, big boys don't cry. So it's no surprise to see that in society, men commit up to 90% of all violent crimes because we are always angry inside. So to be a real man is to be alive. Now, I was told to be a real man. So misogynistic words like bitches lingered in the tidbits of our tongues. We lived in concrete blocks with no gardens, but would still ask where the hoes at. Listen, bro, fact is, we were lied to. We were told that it's okay for a man to sleep with as many women as he wants, but we were never told about love. Never told that love could heal the greatest pain, like a needle to the vein is the drug that we need. I wish we could sell bags of love. Instead of crack or weed, just imagine the change that you would see. Crack addicts would just be people who are higher on love, and crack babies would just be babies who were born with love, and rehab would be where all the haters went. The fact is, we were lied to, given negative images for us to aspire to. So to be a real man is just another lie too. So this goes out to all the men who are real because they have beating hearts, who aren't afraid to cry, men whose emotions show as clear as the moonlit sky, men who write poetry in the middle of the night and read books and meet up at the coffee shop or the library to discuss bell hooks. We rule cool. Men who can say I love you or give each other hugs without saying no homo. Men who can speak of love openly. Like an envelope, open me and you will see what is written inside. Men who want love, but not the kind you make in the club, the kind that your ancestors once spoke of. It isn't a myth. Imagine roses are red, written in hieroglyphs, ode to a naked beauty in Meroitic script, Swahili spoken word across the Serengeti about how the sunrise over the horizon reminds us of the beauty in a woman's face when she smiles. Listen, bro, the fact is we were lied to. We were given negative images for us to aspire to. So why would you want to be a real man when you can be you? So be you. Do not be confined by society's ideals because real men don't exist. Only men who are real. And so, thank you.
So I'm the audience now. I'm clapping for everybody.
Thank you. So
thank you. When did you write that? 7 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, looking back, it's like, wow, it's almost like a completely different life, you know. But that was also part of my journey along the way. You know, I had started questioning this idea of like what it means to be a real man or a good man or any kind of man like that. And that was a lot of the times that the kind of language that was used in so many different places, and I felt that that was the language that was projected onto me, but it didn't feel like it was who I was. And so part of that journey was writing this and trying to explore what does it mean, like who are we really outside of these labels? You know, who are we outside of the labels of real man or, you know, real woman or whatever labels that might exist? Like, who are we when we're by ourselves, when we're at our most vulnerable moments? And that's what I was really trying to explore, because I know that for me, if you take away maybe my appearance or my agenda and you just look at the things that I do, and the way that I am, most people will probably characterize me as a more feminine person than a masculine person, you know? And I think that, like, and it doesn't mean to say that, like, that one gender behaves in a certain way and the other does in another way. It's to say that we are all behaving in ways that are both masculine and feminine. That gender isn't fixed. You know, it's not just one or another, but there's parts in us as human beings, right, that contain both. And so it's like we have to accept that we are both and actually live in the balance of that. And, you know, that poem is trying to explore some of those issues. So, yeah.
Can you go back to, I mean, do you remember the moment you wanted to write it, or what happened before? What made you want to write it? I mean, do you remember the night you wrote it? And I mean, what you say is that all the anger coming from, like, not crying, not expressing yourself, and that actually the masculinity that we are seeing is the negation of every other feeling that you're not being able to express. So Absolutely. Was there something you felt or experienced that night? Because in the book you say you come from a culture that is actually very capable of crying, that you had known tears and that you had seen men crying. And then later on you have been taught, like, crying is not what a man or a boy should be doing. And was that, like, cracking up when you started writing this kind of poems? Was it cracking up this false self that you had put above your healthy way of first being introduced to manhood, and then putting this hard code of masculinity? And is that poem sort of a breakthrough for you, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I wrote that poem when it was a time where I really felt alone. You know, I really felt like I was not able to express myself and be my true self, particularly with the people who I was closest with in my personal relationships. And I felt as though like there was an internal conflict between who I was as a person and who I was expected to be. And, you know, growing up, I had some, and it's really interesting, I had some very healthy examples of positive masculinity. But I think one of the things that happened was seeing the much older men become emotional later on in their lives is something that happens because they realize how many years they've wasted being disconnected from their partners, from their children, and so forth. And then eventually, even they too break, right? And then you either break and go onto a new path, or you break and unfortunately negative things happen. And I think that some of the pressures of masculinity can be quite intense, particularly in those years of like teenage years for young men, up until like 30, early 30s, even 40s. And I think those are the years where there's a lot of expectation and what you need to do as a man that gets placed on you by society. And sometimes you don't know where to go or how to be. So yeah, writing that book was really kind of like a breakthrough moment for me. And I started to find my voice. So writing the poem, I really started to find my voice. It was a breakthrough. And I felt that I was able to communicate how I was feeling through that poem. You know?
I love when you say disconnected to their wives and their children, and then you say that this poem made you understand your own voice. Like the disconnection is not only to outside, but mainly also towards the inside. It's like you really, if it's a phone line, you just don't connect to you first, and then you can't relate. And I think I think it's also irritating, as you say. We are used to expecting from man this kind of functioning in they're supposed to provide home, to provide to provide certain things that are strong. And do you think that women appreciate, when you say you're called a more feminine man, is it something you see women appreciating, or do you think women are also kind of expecting these traditional male roles from men because they too have been in a process of being in toxic images of manlyhood? And do you see women reacting to your changes in a positive way, or do you think part of their images are part of the problem because they actually support many women would criticize it consciously, but maybe on an unconscious level because they too have these images. How do you see women reacting to the changes you have been going through or supporting other young men to go through?
So I think generally speaking, I would say that women have largely been a positive advocate for men and men's healing process. I think women want the best from men, not even in terms of like providing or so forth, but emotional well-being. Oftentimes more than us ourselves as men, you know. But I do think that also there can be an issue of what is known as internalized patriarchy. And so what that means is sometimes there's ideas that the patriarchy enforces on you and the way that you need to see the world as a man or as a woman. And sometimes it can be that a woman will expect the man to be strong, to be a provider and so forth, and maybe not realize that may be damaging, or the extent to which that may be damaging towards a man as well. And you know, there are some men who are just emotional, right? But it's almost as if like there's a limit to how emotional you can be before you start to look undesirable it's really interesting as well, because I asked this question at a talk that I did once, and I said, how many, and it was I asked it to both the men and the women, and I said to the women, if you were out in public and your partner got into a fight and they got beaten up, right, would you still be able to see them as the same man that they are, or would they feel lesser, in your opinion, right? And the majority said that they would feel lesser. And that wasn't, you know, that wasn't a crowd of people who are toxic or anything. That was just this was a crowd of people who were quite informed on issues of patriarchy and gender and so forth. And they said that they would see their man as lesser if he got into a fight or was trying to defend them and he wasn't able to do that. And I also asked the men, how would you feel if, you know, you were with your partner and you got into a fight where you weren't able to win or defend them? And the men also said that they would feel weaker or lesser and less like as a man. And so it's like we are reinforcing these ideas of aggression, of violence, but also still wanting men to be emotional and, you know, loving and caring and so forth, when the two ideas are completely contradictory. And then if you look at what type of men are celebrated in the mainstream kind of media, the film stars and so forth, you very rarely get to see like the emotional man, or the man that, you know, is caring, or the man that is kind of like entirely loving and vulnerable without also having to be strong. If a man is shown as loving and vulnerable and caring and maybe quote unquote weak, there's also a side where maybe they're shown as physically strong to make up for that, you know. And I think we have to just allow like men to be, I want to see very ordinary men. And it's really interesting, just to make one last point. So Fenty Beauty, they released like a the lingerie and underwear line. And obviously Fenty's for women, but they also released a men's version. And what was really interesting is the male models that they used were just kind of very ordinary, non-muscular, like quite large men, and men of different sizes. And it was really interesting seeing the internet's reaction to that, and how many men came out and saying, this is the kind of body that I have, and I have body issues. Like a lot of men have body issues, but they don't feel confident enough talking about it, and that they felt represented in those moments. And so I think we have to really think about men and women. We have to question ourselves when we say, okay, this is the change what I want to see, but also what do I do that keeps on validating it? You know, because what you want and sometimes what you do are two different things. And that's what we have to kind of like question.
Mm. So, I mean, we are skipping the reading in English. Is that okay with you? So no, we can talk. I just didn't want to take you away from the reading. So if you're happy while we talk, I'm happy.
Yeah.
But you can also, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just wanted to be sure that not later on you're going to say, I mean, all my time is over and I didn't read from my book. And
no,
yeah.
Of course not.
Okay. Okay, because we've just kind of changed the concept. I would like to, I mean, there's so many things I would like to know from you. Like maybe not everybody knows that you work with young men. So you speak from your own experience, but you also speak from like helping other young men grow up and reflect on their own masculinity. Maybe two things I'd like to know about that. One thing is just refer to what you just said is, I would like to know, what do you think about the matter of guilt? If you say, how do young men handle if they make if they're flawful, or if they or if they commit a mistake? Is that something that young men learn to integrate? Or empathy, like when they hurt somebody, is it possible to understand what they did to the other, or is it, in terms of mask off and mask on, more important to put the mask on and just say, you know, I mean, maybe I hurt you, but I didn't want to. So how do they handle guilt and empathy in this kind of, with the person they hurt?
So with a lot of the young men that I've worked with, they they know, right, when they have acted in a way that has been hurtful towards other people. The difference is whether or not they're willing to let go of that ego, that power, because basically male privilege gives you that illusion of power, right? That you can dominate this other person and then you don't have to apologize for what you've done. And so the question is whether or not they can let go of that, because empathy is understanding the other person's experience and your experience and in relation to each other, right? And so if you are constantly told that you have to be aggressive, that you have to be dominant, you can't be empathic and dominant. That doesn't, those are conflicting ideals. And so for a lot of the young men, one thing that I've noticed whilst working with them is that when they are in public, when they are surrounded by friends, when they are surrounded by maybe like other students and so forth, they don't want to let go of that image, right? That image of them being strong. Because if you have to apologize and say sorry, that's immediately seen as being weak. So they don't want to let go of that image of being strong. But when you're speaking to them privately, one-to-one, almost every young man who I've worked with who has that strong facade, like when we're talking one-to-one, has been incredibly emotional. I've had young men who have just got into a fight and then have started crying because they feel like they don't have any friends, or their friends are fake, or no one cares about them, you know. And I think for a lot of those men, there is this almost desire to be cared for. There's this desire to be loved, right? But they don't know how to seek that. They don't know how to communicate that. And so when that language is no longer there, what do they use? They use power and they use dominance. And that's the thing that we are reinforcing in our young boys. And so if we can teach our young boys to communicate those desires for love and empathy and being cared for, as well as caring for others, I think that's something that can transform us, you know.
How will you teach it? How do you teach it?
You have to teach it from a young age. You have to also, from a young age, you have to also make it relatable, right? We have to teach by example, I think. So with all the young men that I speak with, I teach it from a way that, listen, this is also something that I've experienced. You grew up in an environment where you have to be strong and, you know, fight or whatever. I grew up in the same environment, right? And then that doesn't mean that you can't change the way you think. I've been able to do that. And I give them examples of other people who've been able to do that without having to be this stereotypical man. And so that relationship is what's really important. And I think for anyone who works with young people or may have young people in their lives, family, friends, etc., especially young men, you have to think about what kind of relationship are you cultivating between you? Is it one that's just surface level? Or is it one that actually, like, I can say that I really know this person? And I think that for a lot of young men, they are so far removed from other people that they don't have that depth of relationship. So you really have to like focus on that, having that relationship, and then being able to transform that. Because none of us are going to open up to someone we don't trust, right? And none of us are going to change if we don't have that relationship with someone. And I think that even the data reveals that, you know, think back to your school times, the best relationships that the subjects that you enjoyed the most was largely related to the relationship that you have with the teacher, right? I mean, that is like some of the basic things. And so we have to think about what kind of relationships are we having with our young men? Is it one that just tells them what to do this, be like that? Or is it one that actually allows them to express themselves?
Let's take some class and race into this. I mean, we're talking about young boy, but certainly they're brought up in very different ways and with very different role models. So in your book, you write about poor guys or living in neighborhoods that are problematic or, So where do you see the differences, the main differences, but also the similarities? I mean, I believe even though there's many things different between the classes, there must be some common ground as well. And in terms of race, do you see boys from the Black community or other communities being confronted with different challenges than the white communities?
Mm-hmm. So what's really interesting, especially that intersection of race and class and so forth, even race and class and sexuality and other markers as well, religion, etc., is that within each community, there are kind of toxic examples that reinforce that, right? But there are also very liberating examples within those communities as well. And so let's say, for instance, you look at working class communities, in very kind of like impoverished circumstances, it can be quite brutal in terms of like how you survive as a man, how you make money and so forth. A lot of violent crimes, etc., maybe drugs involved and so forth. But also it can be very liberating in terms of like the connections that you have through local communities, through sport or through exercise and so forth. I know that for a lot of the young men I've spoken to or worked with in the past, I've used basketball as a way to connect with them and to build relationships. There's some who have used boxing, for instance, has been really, really incredible because it opens up that one-to-one connection. I used to take a martial arts class, not that I was any good, but one of the reasons why I kept going, and there were so many young people there, especially young boys, was the relationship that they had with their teacher. And although it was martial arts, but the teacher was someone who actually preached a lot and spoke a lot about peace, being peaceful, about self-discipline, about compassion and caring for others. So I think that's some of the positive examples that can also come out. And in the element of race, so it's really interesting because obviously we know that there are stereotypes and stigmas attached to being a young Black man, especially in terms of like aggression and violence and danger and so forth. But a lot of these stereotypes are something that emerges in the West and is quite strong in the West. And so what I try to do is I try to open up examples of how different things operate around the world. So if I see a young Black boy here, I'll say to him, well, do you know that in Nigeria or in Congo, men hold hands, men who are friends with each other hold hands walking down the street or kiss each other to say hello, and they're still seen as men. There's nothing different or anything about them. That's normal. And just if you lived in a different part of the world at a different time, what you conceive about yourself would be different as well. Just as in Europe, I used the example of high heels, and now it's largely obviously a woman's shoe, but it came into Europe via Persia, and it was a shoe that horse riders used to wear. And King Louis XIV, for example, was someone who popularized it. And so if you think about what it means for people like King Louis XIV and the aristocratic French or European society wearing high heels then, and that was seen as normal. But now, if you as a young European man walk through the streets of Paris in high heels, how many people are going to accept you, right? And so it's like masculinity is this ever-changing thing. It's ever evolving, but the only thing that really is the truest is what we all accept and believe. So if we can all accept and believe it to be something that's positive, then let's do that,
I had to think of, remember there was a time during Barack Obama's presidency where he tried to address the issue that a lot of the Black communities, actually, a lot of the kids grow up without their dads. And he tried, without a racist thing to it, he tried to address the issue. Like, what does it mean to the Black communities that the boys grow up without their dads, that they get used to this, and that they think it's a masculine pattern to leave when it's too much? I mean, is that something you consider specific, or rather a bigger problem for the Black community? Or do you think we look at it in a different way when it happens in the Black community? You have this great quote that you said changed your perspective by Tupac, I guess, yeah, where you where you have a great passage in the book where he does the same, like he reflects on the images of manhood that he grew up with, also like raping our women. Why are we making them so unhappy? Do you think this helped the Black community, or do you think it stigmatized them even more, or how do you look at this?
I think the issue of patriarchy and toxic masculinity is definitely a global issue and one that affects all races. I think that as minorities or people who are minoritized in the West, right, especially in terms of like, if you could look at Black people in the UK or Europe or in America, there is such a hyper focus because we're a smaller group and because there's less representation, if you think about it, in the mainstream as well. And so the issue of kind of absent fathers and so forth, I think that whilst there is an issue that transcends across all communities, I think that one of the things that often happens is we lose the surrounding, we decontextualize, right? The surrounding factors that also influence that young man's life, you know, that young Black man's life. So we decontextualize that the fact that in a lot of Black communities are incredibly underfunded in terms of access to education, in terms of access to healthcare and jobs, in terms of access to simple things like green spaces or parks, you know. And this is for anyone who knows how America has systematically underfunded so many communities, particularly minority communities across the states. We see how these things play out. If, as a young man, if there's no opportunity for you to work or to further your education, you know, some of the things that's going to likely to happen is you'll become a victim to crime, you know, and that's just one of the unfortunate consequences of systemic inequality. And I think that one of the things that when we talk about the issues of race and so forth, we have to talk about it in terms of like, okay, what are also the systemic issues that are impacting the way this young person or this young man or this young Black boy sees themselves? So is it just a case of that the father is not absent? Because I think there's a lot of mothers who are doing absolutely incredible jobs. Like, I mean, I don't even know how, like, being a single mum, I don't even know how you'd be able to do that. But like, they're superheroes, in my opinion, and they're doing incredible work. But what does it mean if this young Black boy is growing up and they are, you know, the father isn't in their life, but they have aspirations to go to university, but they're stopped by police regularly every time they walk down the street, right? Which we know that statistically, especially in the UK, young Black boys are 22 times more likely to be stopped by police. So what does that mean for someone's frustration and anger? What does it mean if you're expelled in schools more at a higher rate because you're targeted in that way? So I think we have to look at it as a holistic picture rather than one specific thing.
I'm coming to the last thing I would like to talk to you about, and that is, like, we talk about politics and masculinity and the man represented in politics, or what is represented as a successful man in politics. And since we have very toxic patterns in the last years, at least in the media that we saw, I mean, we have Putin with halfway naked on his horse. We have seen Duterte, who is who is responsible for crime, and there's simply nothing happening to him. Then we have Trump and all his sexist rhetoric. I mean, what do you think about the successful politician in a man? Do you think Joe Biden is in any terms a chance for something new? If we think of the image he showed with his son and his father in the time where you saw a very loving father and son photograph, and I think Trump was mocking it, and people were mocking it like it's an homoerotic picture between the father and the son. So I would like to hear what you think of the images, and maybe also be very interested about what do the boys you work with say about these men. Do they affect them as an anti-hero or as a role model? I mean, do they feel appalled or do they feel attracted? Because in the end, they are the most powerful men in the world. They rule countries. They meet on a global scale. They are represented in media. So, and is there a cure to this? I mean, I would definitely call this a toxic leadership. And if there is a cure to this, what could it be on this micro level that you are also working on a day-to-day basis with people?
It's really interesting because I think that politics often represents the extremes of society, whilst also influencing those extremes to manifest, right? And so if you look at someone like Donald Trump or like Bolsonaro or like Boris Johnson here in the UK, it's as a result of those kind of systemic indoctrinations that create these people. And then they put them in these platforms, and then suddenly everyone's like, how did that person get there, right? Because they've been reinforced along the way. So if you think about what it means to have power and male privilege, it essentially means to live with no consequences or no real consequences. And so you think of Donald Trump. Let's compare Donald Trump and Barack Obama, right? Barack Obama had, and I'm not saying that I completely agree with everything Barack Obama's ever done, because he's someone who's also worthy of critique. But Barack Obama had basically no controversial issues whilst in office. If we take aside his policies, right, and just look at his personal life, he's a family man, married, etc., etc. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was filled with controversy in his personal life. Now, what I want you to do is just swap places. Right now, how long do you think Barack Obama would have lasted if he would have done and said what Donald Trump has done and said in his personal life? He would have never become president, and we have actual audio recordings of Trump saying and doing what he's done. Now, imagine that was Barack Obama. Imagine that was any other black man, and that's the thing with male privilege, especially white male privilege, the intersection of race and so forth, is it accentuates another group whilst putting down another group, and so we're allowing in these political positions, we're allowing so many men to exist and to go through with power, but without consequence. And I think there is possibility for change, absolutely. I think that some of the things that can happen is the people who are used to an old way, want an old power, want to see that power continue. But there's lots of people who are progressive. There's lots of people who are looking towards a brighter future, who are seeing the problems in the way that we live now and challenging that, hoping for a better future. These things take time, but I think over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years, we'll start to see a politics that is hopefully a bit more wholesome and a bit more representative. And I don't necessarily have this is the thing, I don't necessarily have individual faith in Joe Biden per se or anyone else. But one thing I've noticed is there's a lot of, he's making very strategic decisions in terms of who's behind him. So he's actually partnering up with quite a lot of women progressive politicians who are bringing forward ideas that can change the way that we see now. And so what is the direction? Hopefully it's progressive. Hopefully we just don't go back to the old style that we've known of, like a hard fist ruling and so forth, because we're seeing that doesn't work, especially in a pandemic. We need a politics that's passionate and compassionate and progressive as well. And we have to have someone who embodies that in the leadership, but also in the policies that are created as well. So hopefully that answers your
question. But did you see an effect in the young man you worked with? I mean, just the sheer fact that they see somebody so self-centered like Boris Johnson. I mean, even when the coronavirus started, he was like, well, what's going on? Then we're going to have all the people infected. It's going to be okay, till the situation got so worse he couldn't stop denying. Then Trump did the very same thing. I mean, do you think it really it makes your kind of work more difficult because they are so impressed by the ignorance of these men, and they seem to get through with it. I really enjoy your definition of patriarchy, because you simply say it's patriarchy is that men get through with almost everything because the world is designed to pave their way in a way.
Yeah.
So it's so normal for them to just like be like train. You have these two things. I still think, as you know, it's not like that for every man. But if men like to ride on that ticket, they can easily do so. And it's even more hard for men who don't. But I would be very interested in your everyday work. Has Trump made it harder? Like when you speak of values, and then they are like, why should I be a nice person? Look at him. He became the president of the USA with the worst language, with the worst kind of treatment towards minorities. I mean, what values are you talking to me about? It's just work, and I will never get rewarded. I will be a loser because the winners talk like losers nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with someone like Trump, there's definitely some young men who agree with him in a sense of power. They see themselves aligned to power, right? And that's what they're trying to emulate. They're trying to emulate the power. They're trying to emulate the material wealth and the capital, rather than who he is as a person, you know. And sometimes, like as men, and generally living in a patriarchal capitalist society, we immediately place respect on someone who's made a lot of money, regardless of how much money they've made. But one of the positive things is that a lot of these young people aren't relating to, particularly young boys, they don't relate to people like Trump. They don't want to be like them, and they don't respect them. The issue is that now there aren't those politicians who they feel represented by. A lot of the politicians that we have, particularly who are in, you know, parliamentary seats and so forth, they're not people who actually come from those communities where, you know, the work is needed the most. You know, they're not actually people who understand or spend time in those communities. So if you're asking whether or not they're going to vote, it's like, why should they vote for someone who they don't see themselves aligned with? You know, and I think actually those groups of young people are perhaps the truest voters, because you're supposed to vote. A lot of people say vote for the lesser of all evils kind of thing, right? But that shouldn't be the system of representation. You're supposed to vote for someone who you believe in. And then I have young people, young men say to me, young boys say to me, I don't believe in him, so I'm not going to vote. I don't believe in this person, they're not going to vote. They're a liar. And what's really interesting is Jeremy Corbyn in the UK was someone who, for the first time, a lot of young people, a lot of young men, young boys particularly, in areas like Tottenham, right, related with someone like him, because he was in those communities. He'd shown time and time again that he cared. But the system of politics, again, you know, Jeremy Corbyn isn't someone who is necessarily perceived as masculine. One of the things that was framed was, what are you going to do if there's a war? You're not going to attack anyone. I mean, that's the whole point. There shouldn't be wars, you know? And some of the things that, if we look at some of the language that Trump uses, oh, we're getting you weapons. Boris, there's been 16 billion. Imagine in the UK, 16 billion pounds has just gone towards military defense in the United Kingdom, set by Boris Johnson at a time where there's a pandemic going on and there's the highest rates of unemployment and food bank usage across the entire country. They've decided to buy more guns. Like, the country should be absolutely outraged right now. But because the main thing is like, oh, we accept that these men are making powerful decisions, they're going to make the right decisions as long as they show that we're a strong country. But what about showing that we're a compassionate country? What about showing that we are people who care about each other? And so I think that all that money that's being used could be used to feed people. It's just that simple. But again, it's reinforcing these political ideas of like being toxic and being strong is the right way to lead.
You had this visionary and very optimistic sentence in the beginning when you said that you really think that in the way masculinity changed when it became more toxic in the representation in music and media and whatever, you believe we can make a difference now and like reshape the image again. And I think we're in better times than ever, maybe because of the debates we are having due to LGBTQ movements. make us think so much about sexual identity and representation and who we are. So they actually open a path for all of us to talk about it. If you would, I think we feel it already, but if you think of the masculinity you would like to see represented in the next 10, 15 years, what would you like to focus on? And what do you think societies need to make it possible, to make it a bigger movement? Where would you like say, well, if we take a look at these three areas and work on these really hard, I think these could be a changing point where we reach a new image and new possibilities for all young men and women.
I think one of the main issues that we need to look at is education and representation as well. How are we educating the young men, young boys, etc., from a young age, from primary school onwards? We know that a lot of schools are actually very kind of like patriarchal, toxic environments. For example, there's certain there's some policies in schools are very gendered, that and the language around it is very gendered as well, in the sense that you often tell young girls in schools that they have to dress appropriately because it's a negative influence on the male teachers. What does that mean about, what is that saying to young girls, and what is that saying to young boys as well, in terms of like the relationship that they have with their bodies and other males and male authority figures as well, right? Rather than actually placing the onus on those boys to control themselves, or on those men, we're placing it on the girls to minimize themselves, to shrink themselves, and think about how they can reduce being a victim, when it's never about the victim, it's about the perpetrator and holding them accountable. And so for me, I think education is part of it. I think representation across all boards, in terms of like mainstream movies and so forth, in terms of music, in terms of books, etc. What are we exposing these young people to? And I think now more than ever, we probably have the opportunity to, because of social media, because of just how well we're connected and how easily we are connected than ever before, to spread ideas. But I really do think there needs to be a movement. I really think that, a very conscious movement, in the way that, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, this year, it raised a certain issue in regards to quite specific issues of race. And I know that one of the narratives that came of it, or out of it, was that it's not just enough to not be racist, you have to be anti-racist, right? You have to show that you actively oppose racism and systemic racist structures. And I think about, well, what does it mean in the sense of gender and patriarchy, right? It's not just enough to be a man who supports gender equality, but how do we actively divest from the patriarchy? How do we remove ourselves from male privilege? How do we remove ourselves or oppose the patriarchal movement? And I think those kind of movements is something that there needs to be like a global awakening in the same way. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen. I'll leave that to whoever starts it. But I think that the ideas and the imagination and the desire is all there. It's just bubbling under the surface. And the right conditions, when it all comes together, will hopefully get to a point where, those changes start to be made.
This is such a very powerful vision, I guess. And it includes so many layers that I really hope maybe it's going to happen. And I think people like you and JJ Bola, Sei kein Mann, and this book are really contributing to this kind of change. Also holt euch dieses Buch, get this book, give it to people under the Christmas tree, or send it to them via post, because we might not be allowed to see each other in Christmas. So this is a very good starting point, I guess, to reflect on patriarchy, on self-images, on self-restrictions, on society, on poverty, on really so many aspects. And it's so accessible. I think you have really shared a lot of your intellectual, but also your practical knowledge that you have acquired during the years of writing, of working with these boys. I would really love to know so many more things, like what would you tell them and so on. But I think people have to read that book to find out.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's no matter if in English or German, I think it's just important that people read it.
Thank you. And I want to add as well, like, this isn't, I'm not the first person to have been writing about this. You know,
nobody's the first, and never again. We exist for such a long time.
Exactly. And we're building on the work of each other. We're building and so forth, right? And so even the point that I'm able to contribute to this and it's taken a little bit further, someone else is going to take it further and then further and then further, you know. And I think actually sometimes we want things to change instantly. And, you know, it would be great if it could, but in real terms, it's never really like that. It's gradual change that is the long-lasting change that we want to see. And I think this is just a part of it. So I'm looking forward to also what other people are going to contribute. You know, what is going to be another Zeitkanman type of thing? Is it going to be a movie? Is it going to be a film or so forth? And I think this is all part of the big kind of like collective movement that we are all a part of and we are all discussing, you know.
Yeah, you're so right. It's like there's this quote, you have to have a village to raise a child. I think you have to have a village to change an idea in the world. It's like sometimes when there's ideas, I think I can't go on repeating it. I said it so many times. And then you figure out that this is maybe a new audience and they haven't heard it yet. And so to oneself, one might even sound repetitive and you think you know it all because you're so deep into it. And some people are deep into it. But for some people, it's really new. And as you said, even if you come across a few ideas that are well known, they are still written in a very personal way. And no, I mean, there's tons of love stories, and yet every love story moves us when it's told and written well. And I think it's the same with this book. You found a very authentic way of telling your story and about patriarchy and growing up and becoming softer. It's also about becoming softer and handing over that softness to other young men and maybe improving the life of many families and friendships, love affairs and loves, whatever.
Yes, so, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, JJ, for a great book and your time. And
thank you for having me. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And you know, great reading as well and great questions. I really enjoyed talking about it.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you. We haven't heard much of you read in English, but I guess that's okay because you shared so many personal things from, in your unique way. And I was very happy we could
one day I'll read in German, you know.
We'll get back to you. You will, you'll come back when the pandemic is over. You will come here and read your own German book. So, yeah.
I look forward to it.
Okay, JJ. So stay healthy, stay away from whatever you can, stay at home, and hope to see you again with your next book or your next project or with the German edition that you're going to be reading when you come to Germany. You haven't been here because of the pandemic, I guess. You haven't done any bigger readings in person.
Not only early on, but but not anything recent.
Yeah. And, they canceled everything.
Yeah, so it's kind of been difficult, really, to be honest. But hopefully next year, we'll be able to come down and for a while as well. So fingers crossed.
So maybe you'll stop by in Heidelberg then.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. JJ, thanks a lot, and hope to see you again.
Thank you. Take
care. Bye. You can stay in here. We will just wave goodbye to the people. Okay, bye. Thank you.